So Jean Baudrillard was a French postmodernist philosopher. He was a post-structuralist philosopher, and what that means is earlier there were structuralist philosophers like Foucault, and he said that meaning is fluid, and we'll get into a little more of that means. But he was a sociologist, and he lived during the 20th century. Let me just pull up my slide here to share screen. 1 second. Okay, and this is a critique. So if you've gone to the critique lecture, you know that the parts of the critique are the link, which is how you link into their case and say they actually did what you said you're critiquing. The impact, which is the bad thing that they did, or like how it leads to a bad thing, what they did. And then the alternative, which is literally like just an alternative to like the bad impact or to the like bad action that you point out in the link. All right, so Jean Baudrillard lived in France, and he was born in France in 1929, and he just died like within like the last decade in 2007. Is it the last decade? Yeah, kind of. Not really. A little bit more than that. And he wrote this book called Simulacra and Simulation, where he expounds on this idea of what signs and what modern society or postmodern society, because we know modern society is the 20th century, and that was, for example, World War II and other 1900s. That was the 20th century. And he kind of expounded on, now after the modern century, after we have World War II and all those major events, and we turn into the 21st century, we get into these ideas of postmodernism as contrasted to modernism, which was kind of the prevailing theory during World War II and in that era. So he was a semiologist, which means that he was concerned with linguistics and the study of signs, so like the meaning of language. And he lived during a lot of conflict on a global scale in US engagement. So it wasn't like World War II, but the US was also involved in a lot of conflict, for example, in the Middle East. They had the Gulf War, they had Bush's ongoing wars that weren't never like publicly acknowledged, but persisted into the 21st century. And he theorized and tried to understand like this new type of experience, this new world that characterized the 21st century. And that's why he is a postmodernist, because he came after modernism. He's a post-structuralist because he came after the structuralist theory of, say, for example, thinkers like Michel Foucault, who we haven't really gone through, but in my next lecture, A Gambit in Biopolitics, we'll go through more of his theory. And now to the next slide. Oh, and also he was French, so he wasn't actually American. So maybe that kind of helped him have like a less like American continent and like all this like patriotism above everything else over like human rights kind of like thinking. Maybe he was like more free thinking, because I think they had like they had like Sartre and like a lot of like prominent philosophers in France at that time. Okay, so his theory was kind of like inspired this movie called The Matrix, and I guess it's not really our generation, but you've probably heard references. I don't know if you can give like a thumbs up if you heard references of The Matrix. Let me see on the chat. It's basically okay, yeah, it's a movie, Kessler. So this is a scene from the movie, but basically the movie is about this dude, and actually I've never watched it, even though I'm talking about it. I've just watched like a clip of it for a philosophy class I took. And in the movie, this dude, I don't even know his name, wakes up. If someone can tell me his name, that'd be good. I know his, like, isn't that Keanu Reeves or something? Anyway, so he like realizes that he's actually in this like matrix, which is like he's inside this like computer like system, and it's inspired by the theory of Baudrillard. And actually in the movie they have a like picture of his book in it, and the directors were like, oh, this is where we got our idea. And the main character learns that he is being used as like an energy source, and his whole world is coded or computer simulated. And so this is when he gets in contact with like people who realize that his whole world is like a matrix, and it's showing him that he can like just get stuff out of the Matrix and be like, oh, this is not the real world, and it just like simulates everything. But however, Baudrillard, yeah. Sorry, what's up, Cressler?
Can you show us the clip? Because I think we would fully understand it if we could actually see the movie clip.
All right, that's a good point. I'll just keep talking, and then we can actually go and look at it, because I think that would actually be interesting. Let's see, it might be a little bit laggy, but let's see, YouTube. It's like the Matrix. Hey, Chloe, do you know the name of the other person in that scene?
Like who Keanu Reeves is?
No, the other guy. The one who like tells him that he's in the
Matrix. I don't remember the other guy's name.
Who is that guy? Neo and let's see. Matrix. One sec. I'm gonna take like one more minute and see if I can find it. If not, I can just kind of tell you what happens in it. Matrix. Oh, the construct.
The other dude's name is Morpheus.
Yeah, this is it. Okay. Let me screen share one sec. Okay, we're gonna watch a fun ad for a second. Can you hear it actually? Okay, one sec.
Becomes a CarMax. But if you're more of an in-person person, CarMax.
This is
the construct. It's our loading program. We can load anything from clothing to equipment, weapons, training simulations, anything we need.
Right now, we're inside a computer program?
Is it really so hard to believe? Your clothes are different, the plugs in your arms and head are gone. Your hair has changed. Your appearance now is what we call residual self-image. It is the mental projection of your digital self.
This isn't real?
What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain. This is the world that you know. The world as it was at the end of the 20th century. It exists now only as part of a neural interactive simulation that we call the Matrix. You've been living in a dream world, Neo. This is the world as it exists today. Welcome to the desert of the real. We have only bits and pieces of information, but what we know for certain is that at some point in the early 21st century, all of mankind was united in celebration. We marveled at our own magnificence as we gave birth to AI.
AI? You mean artificial intelligence?
A singular consciousness that spawned an entire race of machines.
But basically, what happens is that Neo learns that he is living in a matrix and that the world around him isn't real. And And that is something actually, so the movie was really famous, and I think the directors were like, we took our ideas from Jean Baudrillard, but Baudrillard actually rejected this movie and said that they completely misinterpreted his idea. So I kind of showed you that to show that this is something that we're separating from. So this might be your initial reaction to hearing his theories. You're thinking, oh, this is what it's about. But actually, if we delve deeper, we can see that it's very distinct from this, and almost, I would say, like opposite from what is shown in that clip. So it is concerned with like our conception of what is real, but in a totally different level. And that's where we get to our next slide. It was kind of an idea formulated by René Descartes. He said, "Je pense donc je suis," I think, therefore I am. And he said, like, oh, I can't really prove anything else besides the fact that I'm thinking, and therefore I exist to some degree he doesn't know. But Baudrillard's theory is very distinct from that. He's not making like a skeptical claim. He's making a claim about the world, how the world operates, and how we conceive of different ideas in the postmodern era, which is like the 21st century. So I want you to reject this idea now. It's a totally different argument, but we need to clarify that this is not what we're talking about when we're questioning what is real. And that's where we'll get on the next slide. So Baudrillard was primarily concerned with semiotics, and it ties into the idea of his understanding of like what exactly is real, and he's asking what can we make, what claims can we make about the world, and he ultimately says that we can't make any claims about what is real, and here's why. So he separates things into signifiers and signified, and what he says is that we can make like no, we can't find like, we find like the signified through difference. So he rejected the movie, and this is what his theory says. Signs make meaning through difference, and signs signify because of what they are not because of what they are. So for example, we have this idea of a debater, and he's saying that we can't make an intrinsic claim or statement about what a debater really is outside of the signifiers. For example, debaters are like kind of famous for, you know, using G2 pens and using debate stands, which is on the right there. And that's how you know what a debater is. So an analogy to this is, this is kind of like a little exercise. I want you to define independently what a cat is. And then I'll go and lecture a little bit more. So if you could take maybe a minute, you can just say it aloud and tell me what you think, like what defines a cat.
What defines a cat is its personality.
Okay.
Personality, visuals, depth, how you perceive a cat, and also its diversity.
Okay, so let's take an example of one of the things he said. For example, his personality. How do you define his personality? For example, if he said this cat is like a happy cat, how do you prove that in itself? Because by saying the cat is happy, you're comparing it to, say, another cat, which is like an unhappy cat. Can we find like something that is intrinsic to a cat itself that defines a cat? You can just shoot something in the chat too.
Like whiskers, maybe? Does that count?
Yeah, that counts. That was actually more what I was thinking of in terms of like cats are like defined by their body. Okay, so an example, what Baudrillard would say to that is that we define and understand that the cat has whiskers in relation, and that allows it to be a cat in relation to the fact that, for example, a dog doesn't have whiskers. Okay, so Job said a mammal with soft fur, a short snout, and claws. And Baudrillard would say that the way that we look at a cat is through what it is not. So all of those things are defined. When we see a cat, we're like, okay, it has soft fur, a short snout. Maybe this particular cat has a happy personality, like Kessler said, and it has claws. But we understand that through the framework of like what the cat is not. It's not what the cat is in itself. I think that's a hard concept to grasp at first, but it's kind of like saying we define a cat by saying that it's not a dog, or we define a cat by saying it's not all these other mammals that don't have like soft fur, short snout, and claws, or like one of those things. Do you kind of get that idea? All right, let's move on. So
It's still a little bit confusing.
yeah, okay, so let me just kind of repeat that. So basically, Baudrillard would say that we create like symbols, or we understand things through what they're symbolized by. That's kind of why I put a stop sign in the corner, just to convey that like Baudrillard is concerned with signs. And so the signifiers are signs, and they signify, or they're a symbol for a concept or like a thing. For example, a cat, a debater. I don't know about abstract concepts. Probably abstract concepts you would like include. So he says that things are defined by their signifiers, and that means that through the difference of the signifiers of, for example, a debater to a cat, that is how we understand the concepts of a debater or a cat. It's through what they are not through what they intrinsically are, because we can't make a claim that what makes a cat intrinsically a cat is claws, whiskers, and a short snout, like Job said. So it's kind of understanding that Jason is Jason because he's not Lily. Okay, that's like, do you kind of get that idea? Is that like, there's nothing, okay, that sounds harsh, but I mean, not that, oh my god, I put myself in a hole here. But like, Baudrillard applies that to like all objects, things, and he says that through difference, we understand or we label what they are. Okay, so on to the next slide. The implications of that are significant. So first, signs have no bearing on reality. And we see this further in late stage capitalism, which is just a stage where capitalism is like predominant, and it is also where we see like distinguishing between extreme like upper class and like lower class. And he says that as that happens and capitalism goes to like its logical conclusions, we see more of the simulacra or hyper reality, which is this concept that Baudrillard says occurs as the real becomes replaced by signs, and those signs, which may have signified the real in the first place, now become signs of signs. So he had this book called The Gulf War Did Not Happen, and on the top left you can see, I just grabbed a picture from the internet, and it's kind of someone, I think probably from the Gulf War, and by saying it does not happen, he's not saying that the conflict didn't happen, that there wasn't fighting. He's saying that the war didn't happen because of how people consumed or understood the war through simulacra, which is the sign of a sign of a sign. And what this means is that people were exposed to the war, like worldwide. They like heard about the war through their, for example, computers, like news feeds, on like television. But that was totally detached from like the actual experience of the war. So how can we say that this like depiction of the war is really, you know, the war? It's not. Another way of thinking about this is a pumpkin spice latte. So it has no relation to like the actual pumpkin. Like you obviously wouldn't drink a pumpkin. Like I don't know what I don't think they actually taste like pumpkins. Haven't really tried a pumpkin, but I would guess they don't, because pumpkins are mostly mush. And so in Starbucks you see like it has no relation to the actual thing, and that's a sign, or it's part of the simulacra. Another thing on the bottom, you can see this kind of idea or like visual depiction of like hyper reality. You see like the McDonald's signal, and that's another example where McDonald's has no relation to like the food you're eating. Like the M literally has nothing to do with fast food. It's just an M, like a symbol. So everything is replaced by signifiers, and those signifiers are replaced by signifiers, and thus we lose a real understanding of meaning. So what that really implicates is when he says that we don't really have an understanding of the thing itself. Maybe initially the reference or the signs referring to them actually refer to the real thing, but as we go along and as like we are entering, or we are in like postmodernism, they have no correlation with the real, as the pumpkin spice latte demonstrates. And that's something called hyperreality or simulacra. And simulacra is just a fancy word for like signs. All right. Are there any questions right now? You can also type them into the chat.
So that's kind of how like secondhand sources become third-hand sources, and just like it becomes inaccurate over time.
Yeah, that's definitely what it's saying. It's like a fairly simple concept. I mean, it's not actually. I'm just teaching this, but honestly, I'm like not a postmodern philosopher, and it's very like complex theory, and like there's tons of implications. But we're just going over like the basic debate, how it's important in debate. So hyperreality is the inability to distinguish reality from a simulation of reality, especially in technologically advanced societies where we see the means of communication, like their iPhones through screens. That's the main means of communication, and it creates something called the simulacra. So now going on to the debate applications, we'll see how this applies to debate and how you can use it. Firstly, another thing is that a way of thinking about this is how movements of social progress are co-opted through like symbolism. For example, we see this like shirt and it says feminist on it, but like a shirt that says feminist has like no relation to like actual feminism. It like doesn't have like the active part of like being a feminist, and it doesn't really do anything for the feminist movement. I guess you could argue it does, but it's in itself, it has nothing to do with feminism. And this is an example of like capitalism co-opting movements of social progress, and that's one of the implications of Baudrillard's thinking, and that's one of the ways it's used in debate, is that people will say something if they have a plan or if they have another critique, and they say that progress can be made. It's kind of a pessimistic argument, and it says that like all movements will, or not pessimistic, it does have like an alternative that I think is doing something more, but capitalism will co-opt movements of social progress. And when people say, oh, we can create social progress, Baudrillard would say, no, look at like the structure of the postmodernist world where there is no real anymore, and everything is being replaced with signs, and these signs lose the meaning of the original, as in the case of the shirt that says feminist. So going on to the debate application, remember the first part of a critique is the link. So this is an example of a link I pulled from the Michigan lab file. So this is their card. Charity cannibalism. Today's the West is, can someone actually read the tag for me? Jason, do you mind reading the tag? It's like covered by the top.
Sure. Link, charity cannibalism. Today, the West operates on a consumption of images of pain. The affirmative only keeps putting quarters into our moral register, making it hinge upon listening to the suffering of the others and feeling for them. Absent the constant injection of new images of suffering, the West would collapse. The affirmative is sustaining a system in its death throes. Michigan lab.
Yeah, Baudrillard 94. So basically the tag sums up the argument, and then in the card itself, there's the warrant. The card is like the written part on the bottom. But so this link, for example, if someone had read something where they said we need to create social progress because like this group or like these people are suffering, Baudrillard would say that it's like, well, I can just read the card. We must denounce sentimental exploitation, charity cannibalism being worse than oppressive violence. Exploitation is only there to extract that spiritual raw material that is the misery of people, which serves as a psychological nourishment for our daily lives. Our own efforts to alleviate it function to secure the condition of reproduction of the catastrophe market and the equilibrium of the West. So basically, it says that through these images, through these symbols, the structure of the West, the equilibrium of the West is sustained through the images of suffering, and it's a way of the West like framing itself as necessary, I would think. Not sure if Baudrillard makes that claim, but I think maybe he might, or we might combine it with something else in debate to make that claim. Okay, so that would be the link if they read a social progress plan or a K that says like this is happening and therefore we need to remedy this with like change or like progress. It's kind of complex, and honestly, it's kind of hard for me to understand too, since I've never actually like ran this in a round. I've just responded to it. And I can go over a little bit about responses, but let's go on to the impact part. Also, does anyone have any questions right now? Oh yeah, Kessler, of course. Take care of your computer. All right, let's go on to the next part. So the impact. Do you mind reading the chat, Chloe?
Yeah, impact, war against unknown. War has subsequently become digital, a hyperreal play of information that transcends violence itself. As the spreadsheet becomes the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield, the structural law of domination escapes the material, yet this does not make termination within the matrix any less of a threat.
Okay, so I think termination within the matrix any less of a threat, that just means that like the violence is still ongoing, so the impact is there, and that's the impact card, is that it actively harms people. So it's kind of saying that there's this like constructed reality through like signs that position like the information and like the way we wage war as kind of like necessary. And so like it's very specific on like modern warfare and like modern postmodern ways of like life. So Oberg 16 says, historically, war studies the understanding warfare as the how of waging war reduced to the application of military battlefield tactics. So he's saying that we understand war through like the battlefield tactics that generals make or something like that. And this leads to a neglect of the way warfare is interlinked with dominant legal, political, and colonial discourses. So it's just saying that those get ignored, and that would be your argument there. Liberal wars rest on the policing of a foundational narrative of humanitarian values. Transparency works as an ideology of social control. So they're kind of talking about like the literal spreadsheet, just like a systemic, I guess, or like way of just conducting war. And I guess it's a critique of transparency in the sense that like maybe transparency is the way that we conduct the war. It's transparent in that we have a clear understanding of why we're doing the war. So it works as an ideology of social control, and it gives rise to types of alienation that violently circumscribes the subject from lived experience. So we see that like Baudrillard's kind of thesis there is that it separates you from like the actual reality or like lived experience, where everything must be immediately visible and immediately interpretable. So by trying to understand and by trying to place like solid symbols as connected to reality, we neglect the fact that we're actually separate from reality, which is what Baudrillard claims is true. And so we're kind of just like living this lie of like, we understand what these symbols mean, thus we understand like that we ought to conduct, I guess, war. And so this works as an imperceptible limit, which might trap subjectivity in particular organizational architecture. So it's just saying that by engaging in like this idea of humanitarian effort, perhaps, that would be what they're arguing for, you are trapped within this particular organizational structure, this way of knowing and understanding, which is reaffirmed through the action that they take. Okay, so that's a lot of mouthful of words, and Baudrillard's theory is pretty esoteric, I mean, but also I cut this card like really badly, so don't do that in debate. I just need to fit everything in there. You should definitely not do that, because you will probably someone will read theory against you that says like you kind of cheated by not having the words on everything else clear, because you could have said like something that the card doesn't actually say. But ultimately, Baudrillard is just making a claim about how symbols are produced and how symbols revolve around the way we conduct ideas of social progress. So that's a mouthful. Does anyone have any questions right now, especially for this card? All right, I'll move on. So this is my last slide. the alternative. So remember, it's link, impact, alternative. So actually preface this by saying that there are multiple ways to run the Baudrillard K, and this probably isn't the best way. I kind of constructed this like last minute, and it really depends what cards you're going to read based on what they read. But the alternative in this case, the card I picked, advocates for radical mimicry, or it means that you just ought to like conform to like what is happening and hyper conform to it so that the system will ultimately implode. It's kind of like the argument that people make with like capitalism, is that like we ought to like go along with everything and like let capitalism's like worst impulses go through, and like we shouldn't try to stop them, because ultimately that means that capitalism will like reach its like logical ends and like implode, and like that's the end goal. Otherwise we're just reproducing capitalism and like managing it but allowing it to persist, because we're saying, oh, like look, we can make capitalism like tenable for people and like reduce suffering. Okay, so Paulette 14 says the only option is a radical mimicry of the forms of the system, one that accelerates them. So we want them to accelerate them to the point of their obvious vacuity, so we can show that they're vacuous, and lead them to the point of the collapse of that type of understanding. So we want to collapse that understanding, which maintains the oppressive power, like this intrinsically oppressive power in the first place. So duality reemerges and duality will out. Every attempt at coherence is met by a non-committant incoherence and absence. We affirm this dualistic ontology in a moment of semiotic rupture. So sign rupture. Semiotic just means sign. Nothing becomes wholly transparent without also becoming enigmatic. Duality as a strategy maintains the possibility of mystery and radical alterity. And so like the ultimate alternative you're saying is that first we need to hyperconform to the system and make sure that it collapses. Like in the capitalism example I pointed out, we shouldn't check its worst impulses, but we should let them play out so that they can like, I guess, stab themselves in the back. And then duality as a strategy maintains the possibility of mystery and radical alterity. And this is what Baudrillard says, it doesn't tie you down to claims about the real. And I think that's what he's saying. And obviously I'm not an expert on this, but I'm pretty sure what he's saying is that like by maintaining this mystery and like not like cementing these structures or ideas and of these symbols of what they mean, we are able to move out of them and move out of like oppressive systems, because we understand that they don't represent like reality. All right, so I'm gonna actually read this card because I didn't cut it, but Paulette 14 is an author that I've heard read fairly often, and this is also cut by the Michigan Lab out of an article. So there are several significant like authors that we looked at here. There are definitely more, and you can find different evidence and stuff online through like Open Evidence Project, which is just allows debaters to share information. And that was kind of a complex theory, so I'd like to go a little bit of time. I haven't prepared like a drill or anything, but I would actually like everyone to try to repeat maybe a part of what they learned today. So try to kind of explain Baudrillard's theory and see, and I can try to correct and see if maybe you've gotten like the main concept. And what we're ultimately trying to go for is just like the basic idea of it, and you don't really have to like know exactly how to run it. We can do that, and then afterwards we'll go briefly over how to respond to it. So would anyone like to go first? Otherwise I can call on someone. All right, Anne, are you here? Okay. That's okay. Chloe, would you like to kind of summarize Baudrillard's idea or parts of it?
Okay, so what I got from what you said is sort of that, how do you say his name again? Baudrillard?
I think it's Baudrillard. Wait, it's Baudrillard.
Baudrillard?
Let me type it. Wait, you actually, okay, your
So,
French is better than mine. One sec. We're gonna hear Chloe pronounce it. Yeah, like a real French person. Is that? I don't know how to.
Jean Baudrillard, I think. Baudrillard. I don't know.
I always say like Baudrillard. Ugh. Anyway.
I don't know. Basically, so you were talking about the simulacra, right? So sort of like what I sort of got is that like he sort of thought that we were saturated by like the simulacra and that our lives was like sort of, I don't really know how to describe it. Yeah, it was sort of saturated, like our lives are sort of saturated by the simulacra, and it sort of like perceives a false reality for us sometimes. I don't know, that's what I got.
Yeah. Not just sometimes, but that like reality is like totally gone. We can't return to it. I don't know, actually. Could we return to it? Probably not. Everything is just a sign. And I know that seems like pretty simplistic for him to say, but I think he's making an overarching claim about like society. And so even though you might not buy like that because the M in McDonald's like doesn't really signify what McDonald's is, that's different from like it has like further implications. I hope people aren't running away because they don't want to share. It's okay. You like don't have to get this right. Like I don't have this right. Actually I can turn off the recording too. Or actually, how about this? We can go on and I'll just go over some basic response and then we'll come back and I'll ask. Okay, so basically the way to respond to Baudrillard is just to point out that like Baudrillard like still recognizes like you can't really say that like a Gulf War didn't happen. And so I said that like the people like nearby would still be able to like grasp it, although maybe that doesn't have implications on like a global scale, but they can like still understand that like the war in a real sense. But I don't know in terms of communicating that. But I would also say that like the alt doesn't do anything. Like the alt is like really ridiculous. It basically says like let's not do anything, and you can make the argument that there is no way that hyperconforming is going to lead to the collapse of the simulacra. Like it's already been proven. Like there's like ask them to point out at what point does like the simulacra collapse, and can they give an example of the simulacra collapsing, and they could say no, it's like in its zenith right now. But you could just say like there's like really no proof that it would collapse, and like doing nothing is worse. And like keep asking, for example, in cross-examination, like what exactly does this do, and just like ask it in different ways, and they're gonna be like I don't know, like what does this do, and they can't really give you a straight answer sometimes because it doesn't actually do anything active for people who are oppressed or like groups. So that's pretty much the end of the Baudrillard lecture, and then I'm just gonna ask and turn off the recording right now.